Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lynn Langett, Senior Developer Evangelist for Microsoft in Southern California. My blog is at blogs.msdn.com/SoCalDevGal, and you can find these slides there as well. In today's webcast, I'm going to cover migrating applications to SQL Azure. This webcast assumes some basic knowledge of SQL Azure, so if this is the first webcast that you're seeing for SQL Azure, I might recommend that you check out an Introduction to SQL Azure webcast on the SQL Azure website or via my blog. So today we're going to talk about SQL Azure itself, just very briefly, as I said, and then we're going to get into specific concerns around the migration of applications to the SQL Azure platform. When we look at that, we're going to look at compatibility areas between on-premise SQL Server and SQL Azure. We're going to then look at tools, and the tools are going to be useful for SQL Server to SQL Azure migrations, and also for some other relational database platforms such as Microsoft Access or MySQL. We're going to talk about quick prototype or testing migration scenarios, as well as production migration scenarios, and this talk will include best practices and lessons learned from our SQL CAT or Customer Advisory team. At the end of the webcast, we will take a look at features. So to kick us off, we have one slide to remind us that we're only talking today about one small part of the Windows Azure platform offering. As you see in this slide, SQL Azure is only one type of offering in our cloud offering, and that is our relational database in the cloud. You can see that we have the relational database. We have now SQL Azure reporting in Customer Technology Preview or Beta, as well as data synchronization in Customer Technology Preview. We won't talk about reporting or data sync or some of the other capabilities in this webcast. If you're interested in any of our betas, you can go to SQL Azure Labs and sign up to be a part of it. The Azure platform, of course, includes also other services such as compute and non-relational storage, sometimes called the NoSQL solution. The non-relational storage is offered as Windows Azure Tables. Again, that is not something we're going to be talking about in this webcast. We're going to focus on relational migrations. So considerations around migration of relational applications from on-premise or hosted to the SQL Azure cloud offering include which APIs are supported, how you connect, security, specifics around connection and database sizing, specifics for administration and programmability, and then some other details such as collations. And we're going to cover all these next. Our first consideration is the type of connectivity that you have available for SQL Azure. Currently supported are ADO.NET 3.5 SP1 and ADO.NET 4.0. Also, ODBC is supported. Entity Framework.NET 3.5 SP1, 4.0, and recently added 4.1. Those are all supported. We also have a PHP driver. You'll note that OLEDB is not supported as a method of connectivity to SQL Azure. Another consideration is that the type of security authentication is through SQL Server only, so that passes the username and password in plain text. So you're going to want to encrypt your connection string. You'll note in the bottom of the slide it also says add @ server name to user ID. The reason for that is the high availability under the hood in SQL Azure has DNS routing. So you need to add the first portion of the server name, the randomly generated string, like ABC123. So in other words, if your username were Langett at ABC123 would be the login, which is a little bit different than on-premise. Another consideration is that TCP/IP on port 1433 is the way that you'll need to connect. We do not have support in SQL Azure for dynamic ports, name pipes, or shared memory. Now there is a method of connecting over port 80, which I will demonstrate here shortly using our web client. But for most client applications, you're going to want to connect through 1433, the ones that you write. As I mentioned, SQL authentication is the type of authentication that's currently supported we have had customer requests for federated authentication with Windows federated, and that is something we've announced on the roadmap, but it's not currently available. Another consideration is that you are connecting across the public internet. So because the reliability of the network is not something that you control, we do have patterns available in terms of the connection business logic. And I actually have a reference in the slide to a blog post where we have a helper library that implements a retry pattern based on timing if there were some interruptions in the ability to connect to the service. Another thing that will cause a need for retry is if there were a hardware failure, there would be a failover, and there might be a need to retry during the actual event of the failover. In terms of sizing, we currently offer a web or business edition, and web, of course, is 1 gig or 5 gigs max. Business edition is 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50. So one of the things that you need to consider when you're migrating is what is going to be the potential max size of the data that you're going to migrate. Now, the way, of course, that SQL Azure works is you set up the edition and the max size, but you're only billed for the actual size that the database occupies. If you need to change the size to accommodate larger storage space, the alter database command is supported as shown. You also have the ability to change the max size or edition. Currently, the web and business editions are feature identical, although we've said that in the future this may change, similar to the way standard and enterprise SKUs on-premise have different features. And we have a sample alter database command on the bottom of the slide. Alter database test DB, modify, and set your max size. In terms of security, of course, you're in a shared multi-tenant environment, so you will have familiarity at the level of the database in terms of setting up your logins. And as I mentioned, they'd be SQL Server only. So you can use the familiar T-SQL create login, whatever with the password, and then you can create the user from that login for the particular database. The server roles are a bit different because you are sharing the environment. So some of the T-SQL commands that you're used to from on-prem, such as add role member, are available. Notice we have a role called DB Manager and Login Manager, and these are specific to SQL Azure. So these are, for the purposes of managing security of your databases. And then, of course, you grant your database access to a login similarly to the way you do it on-premise. You create the login and database in master and create the user and grant role in database. And we have some views for you to take a look at the logins that are available, sys.sql_login, sys.databases, and sys.database_principal. SQL Azure, by default, allows no access, and that is by design. So one of the things that you'll need to do in migration scenarios is you'll need to enable your specific client IP to access via the SQL Azure Firewall. And the way that you can enable a specific IP or a range of IP addresses is through the SQL Azure web portal, or you can do it programmatically as it's listed on this slide. There are some views or stored procedures which are referenced. You have a view to see which firewall rules are enabled, and then you have some stored procedures to set them up. If you had a business situation where you wanted to implement a firewall management programmatically, there's also an API, which I have linked in this slide when you pulled on the deck. And then another consideration that you may have is if you have need for a collation other than the standard, which is the SQL_Latin1_general_CP1_CI_AS. That is the only collation that is available currently for SQL Azure at the level of the database. If you had a need for something other than that, then you would need to set column-level collation, as is shown in this slide, where we have examples of the username set to Turkish and the error message set to Japanese. And, of course, that's probably not something that you would have, but it just shows you the syntax or reminds you of the syntax, which is the same as on-premise, to have different collations at the level of a column. All right, in terms of feature parity, if you think of SQL Server, if that's where you're migrating from and you're moving to SQL Azure. From a high level, what you have available are the core objects, and you have the ability to manage the logical server. What you don't have available are the physical objects, such as file groups, full text indices. You don't have a need to set up log shipping or clustering or any type of high availability. So you don't have some of the DBCC commands. You don't have some of the server-level DMVs or system views. We have had a very aggressive release schedule, and if you are doing a migration, I highly recommend that you follow the SQL Azure team blog as well as SQL Azure on Twitter. Also, I try on my blog, which can be found at SoCal DevGal, to do an update every time there is a release. Last year we had, I believe, 4 releases that made new features available. So one of the things that you'll have to be aware of and be on top of if you are migrating to SQL Azure is what features are supported if you're looking for features that aren't already there. So as it says on the slide, most of the RDMS features are already there. So tables, views, stored procedures, triggers, even some of the CLR types such as geometry and geography. Now CLR types other than that aren't yet available, but those are from customer requests mostly. So most of the features are available, and again, I have a link on this slide that goes to MSDN article that says very specifically what's available and what's not. Partially available is the use statement. The use statement this is a little tricky, can reference a database, but you cannot have that statement to change databases. Every time you want to switch to a different database, you need to connect directly to that database, and this is because of the way the high availability is set up with the 3 physical copies of every server and every database, which could be distributed across multiple physical machines that are, more than 3 machines, basically. So to be very clear, when you are connecting, you can connect to a single database only, and if you need to change to connect to a different database, you need to establish a new connection. You cannot implement the use statement. XML data type is available. As of this recording, not all the features around XML are fully there. I believe some of the XML indexing is not yet available. And then, as I mentioned, full text search is not available, remote data access, linked servers, distributed transactions, change tracking, service broker. So there are a set of features that are not available. Fortunately, our tooling is intelligent around which features are available and which aren't. So one of the pleasant things I think you'll find is when you use our tooling to do migrations, you won't have to keep this list of which features are available and which aren't manually. As long as you use updated tooling, the tooling pretty much understands for you. And I have found that to be the case in the 1.5 years or so I've been working with SQL Azure already. I'm sure it's going to get better. So some considerations to think about before we start getting into demos. You need to use data access APIs that are supported, which are ADO.NET, ODBC, Entity Framework, PHP. And of course, you cannot use OLEDB at this time. You need to use a security model that's supported, so that's SQL Auth. You need to use connection management, and we really recommend using this pattern that we have referenced in this deck that has retry logic on sort of a timeout basis. Rather than writing it on your own, just to use our best practice. We really recommend that with customers.